What is up, everyone? My name is Joseph and welcome back to Casually Competitive MTG, where it's our goal to bring you semi-competitive EDH gameplay content that is both fast-paced and entertaining. It's been a while, but welcome back. We're happy to see you here, and to celebrate us being back after a little bit of a hiatus, we decided to play some of our personal and favorite decks for this video. If you can't tell from the video length, this is just a classic casually competitive game, and I think you guys will really enjoy it. The commanders we have for you today are Chulane or Chulane, Teller of Tales, Korvold, Fae-Cursed King, Nath of the Gilt Lead, and Zur the Enchanter. Now before we get into the opening hands and deck introductions, we have a few quick channel promotions. First, this video is sponsored by Alter Sleeves. If you're looking to pick up some cool looking art for your commanders or the cards in your decks without having to physically altering them, check out Alter Sleeves using the link in our description to not only support the channel, but also support artists on Alter Sleeves and pick up some affordable, unique looking card art. If you want to directly support the channel, we have a Patreon, link is in the description, with some reward tiers set up that we think you'll really enjoy if that's something you're interested in. This support goes a long way to help improve these videos, and we really appreciate those who help us out in this way. Next, if you want some casual competitive merch, tokens, or playmats when they're available, head on over to our website, link is also in the description. If you're looking to pick up cards in the near future, click on our TCG affiliate link before you do to directly help out the channel at no cost to you. And finally, if you're looking for some more Magic the Gathering memorabilia, we're affiliated with Flipside Gaming, where if you use our code CasuallyMTG at checkout, you can receive 10% off eligible purchases and support the channel. Now with that out of the way, let's get into the opening hands and deck introductions. I won first in this game, and I played Chulane, Teller of Tales, or Chulane, Teller of Tales, depending on how you want to pronounce it. The goal of this deck is to win with a creature-based combo using your commander's ability to draw your library. The combos in this deck include Shrieking Drake and Mana Breach, or Shrieking Drake and Alurin, or Shrieking Drake and Cloudstone Curio, all when paired with your commander allow you to draw a massive amount of cards, put a lot of lands into play, and eventually find out how to win using something like a Finale of Devastation. My opening hand contained a City of Brass, a Chrome Mox, a Mental Misstep, a Nature's Claim, a Finthorn Elves, a Drannith Magistrate, and a Rhystic Study. Going second in this game is Bill, playing Korvold, Fae-Cursed King. This is a food chain based list that wants to play food chain and have Squee the Immortal either in hand, on the battlefield, or in graveyard or exile, basically anywhere except your library, in order to generate infinite creature mana, and then use Korvold as a draw engine in order to draw your library and find that way to win with all of this creature-based mana and infinite ETBs. Bill's opening hand contained an Urborg, Tomb of Yawgmoth, a Mountain, a Noxious Revival, a Gamble, an Elvish Mystic, a Food Chain, and a Necropotence. Going third is Adam, bringing one of his favorite commanders to the table, Nath of the Gilt Lead. This is a very fun commander to play against, assuming you like discarding cards and just hate having things in your hand. This card looks to grind down hands using cards like Oppression, Sadistic Hypnotist, and just Nath himself in order to slow the game down, all while looking for a win either by overrunning the board or just creating a massive amount of mana and using something like a Finale of Devastation to close it off. Adam's opening hand contained a Swamp, an Overgrown Tomb, a Vampiric Tutor, an Elves of Deep Shadow, a Wishclaw Talisman, an Assassin's Trophy, and a Toxic Deluge. And finally, going last is Nate, playing Zur the Enchanter. This is a consultation and control based deck that looks to play Consultation and Thassa's Oracle in order to win the game. There's nothing too special with this combo, however, using Zur allows you to play some interesting cards like Spoils of the Vault mixed with Phyrexian Unlife to kind of be a pseudo console, and since Zur can tutor up this enchantment, it makes it a little bit more playable. Nate's opening hand contained a Snow-Covered Island, a Sea of Clouds, a Mystic Remora, an Arcane Denial, a Dovin's Veto, an Opposition Agent, and an Ad Nauseam. If you want to watch these games live, we stream them weekly to our Twitch channel, and if you want to check out our non-Magic the Gathering content, there's a link to our second channel in the upper right-hand corner of this video. Now with that all out of the way, let's get into the gameplay. Joseph starts off this game by drawing, playing a City Brass as his land for turn, and then for 0 mana, casting a Chrome Mox. When it enters the battlefield, he imprints a Nature's Claim, and then he taps for 2 mana, taking 1 damage from the City of Brass to cast a Drannith Magistrate. Pretty content with his turn 1, he ships the turn to Bill. Bill draws, plays a Mountain, and then for 1 red mana, casts Gamble. He searches up a card to his hand and then discards a Noxious Revival at random. With nothing left, he passes to Adam. Adam draws and then loses 2 life to shock in an Overgrown Tomb. He then for a green mana casts an Elves of Deep Shadow and then gives the turn to Nate. Nate draws, plays a Sea of Clouds, and then for 1 blue mana casts a Mystic Remora. In response to this, Joseph pays 2 life to cast a Mental Misstep, successfully countering the spell. With nothing left, Nate gives the turn to Joseph. Joseph untaps, and then in his first main phase taps his Chrome Mox for a green to cast a Fin-Torn Elves. With nothing left, he ships the turn to Bill. Bill untaps and then loses 2 life to shock in a Stomping Ground. He then for a green mana casts an Elvish Mystic, and with nothing left, passes to Adam. Adam untaps, plays a swamp as his land, and then taps his mana to cast a Liliana the Last Hope. He then activates this Liliana's +1 ability to kill Joseph's Fin-Torn Elves and punish him for the 1 land keep. With nothing left, he passes the turn to Nate. Nate untaps, plays a snow-covered island, and with nothing to do on his turn, ships the turn off to Joseph. Joseph untaps, and then for a green mana casts a Carpet of Flowers. He then goes to combat and swings Draenith Magistrate at Adam's Liliana for 1 damage. Adam does not block, Lily takes the damage, and in his second main phase, Joseph adds a white mana from the Carpet of Flowers. He then uses his white mana to help cast a Lavinia Azorius Renegade. In response to this, Nate taps for 2 mana to cast an Arcane Denial. The counter resolves, the creature is countered, and Joseph then gives the turn to Bill. Bill untaps, and in his upkeep, Joseph draws 2 cards and Nate draws 1 from the Arcane Denial. In his first main phase, Bill plays an Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth as his land for turn, and he then taps for 3 black mana to cast a Necropotence. He then goes to combat and swings his Elvish Mystic at Liliana for 1 damage, and in his second main phase, he pays 15 life into Necropotence to exile 15 cards. He then immediately goes to his end step, puts those cards into his hand, and then discards down to hand size, and he discards into exile. Adam then goes to his turn, untaps, plays a swamp as his land, and then plays a Chalice of the Void, X equaling 2. He then activates Liliana's +1 ability to give the Elvish Mystic -2, -1, essentially killing it, and with nothing left, he passes the turn to Nate. Nate untaps, and then for 1 mana casts a Sensei's Divining Top. With nothing left, he ships the turn to Joseph. Joseph untaps, and at the beginning of his first main phase, he adds 1 blue mana from his Carpet of Flowers. He then plays a Command Tower as his land for turn, and he uses his floating mana to help cast a Rhystic Study. It resolves, and he then goes to combat and swings Draenith Magistrate at Liliana for 1 damage. With nothing left, he passes to Bill. Bill untaps, does not draw due to Necropotence, and then as his land for turn, plays a Sulphurous Spring. He then for a black mana casts a Vampiric Tutor, paying for Rhystic Study to tutor a card to the top of his library and lose 2 life. He then pays 8 life into Necropotence and immediately moves to his end step to put the exiled cards into his hand. He then discards down to hand size, discarding into exile. Adam then goes to his turn, untaps, and starts his turn off by activating Liliana's +1 ability to give Draenith Magistrate -2, -1. He then goes to combat and swings Elves of Deep Shadow at Bill for 1 damage, and he then goes to his end step, and in his end step, Nate activates his Sensei's Divining Top to rearrange the top 3 cards of his library. Nate then goes to his turn, untaps, plays a Polluted Delta as his land, and then pays 1 life to crack it to shock in a Godless Shrine, losing 2 more life. With nothing to do with this mana, however, he passes to Joseph. Joseph untaps and adds no mana with his Carpet of Flowers in his first main phase, and then just passes the turn without doing anything on his turn. On his end step, Bill casts an Abrupt Decay targeting the Chalice, not paying for Rhystic Study. Since it can't be countered, it doesn't get countered by Chalice and resolves, destroying Chalice. Bill then goes to his turn, untaps, plays an Undergrowth Stadium as his land, and then for 0 mana casts a Lotus Petal, paying for Rhystic. He then casts a Dockside Extortionist, paying for Rhystic this time, and in response to this, Nate taps his Sensei's Divining Top to draw a card and put his top back on top. The Dockside Extortionist then resolves, enters the battlefield, creates Bill 3 treasure tokens, and Bill then pays 3 life into Necropotence. He then goes to his end step to put the cards to his hand, and in response to that delayed trigger, Adam for a black mana casts a Vampiric Tutor, paying for Rhystic Study. In response to the Vampiric Tutor, Nate for 3 mana flashes out an Opposition Agent. In response to this agent, Joseph for 2 mana casts an Eladamri's Call. The Eladamri's Call resolves, Joseph gets an Aven Mindcensor to his hands, and then, still in response to the Opposition Agent, Joseph casts Miscast, targeting Adam's Vampiric Tutor. The Vampiric Tutor is countered, the Opposition Agent resolves and enters the battlefield, and Adam then goes to his turn. He starts his turn off by untapping and then activating Liliana's +1 ability to give the opposition agent -2/-1 until Adam's next turn, and with nothing left, he passes to Nate. Nate untaps, looks at the board, and decides it's best to hold up mana, and he immediately just passes to Joseph. Joseph untaps and at the beginning of his first main phase adds 1 blue mana to his mana pool due to his Carpet of Flowers. He then plays a Forest, and then for 2 mana he casts a Collector Oof. In response to this, Bill cracks 2 treasures in order to cast a red elemental blast, targeting Rhystic Study, paying for Rhystic Study. Joseph then goes to combat and swings Drannith Magistrate at Liliana for 1 damage, and with nothing left, he passes the turn to Bill. Bill untaps and starts his turn off by for 0 mana casting a Mox Amber. He then for 1 mana casts a Soul Ring, and then for 3 mana casts a Food Chain. He then taps for a black mana to cast a Blood Pet, pays 2 life into Necropotence, and then goes to his end step and puts those cards into his hand. Adam then goes to his turn, untaps, and as his land for turn, plays a Castle Lochthwain. He then for 2 mana casts a Wishclaw Talisman, and he then activates Liliana's +1 ability in order to kill Bill's Blood Pet. With nothing left, Adam passes to Nate. Nate untaps and then goes to combat and swings his opposition agent at Bill for 3 damage. Bill chumps the opposition agent with his Dockside Extortionist, taking no damage, and Nate then casts a Mox Opal for 0 mana. He then goes to pass the turn to Joseph, and on Nate's end step, Joseph flashes out an Aven Mind Sensor. Joseph then goes to his turn, untaps, adds 1 green mana due to Carpet of Flowers in his first main phase, and then for 2 mana casts a Destiny Spinner. He then swings all of his creatures at Bill for 5 total damage, and Bill takes the 5 damage. With nothing left, Joseph passes to Bill. Bill untaps, plays a Bloodstained Mire as his land, and then taps for 3 mana to cast a Wheel of Fortune. In response to this, Joseph for 2 mana casts a single target Cyclonic Rift, targeting Nate's opposition agent. In response to the Psych Rift, Nate casts a Force of Will for free, exiling Dovin's Veto and paying 1 life. The Force resolves, the Cyclonic Rift is countered, and with Wheel still on the stack, Nate for a white mana casts Silence. Silence resolves, and then the Wheel finally resolves. Everybody discards their hand, draws a fresh 7, and Bill, not able to cast anything else on his turn, passes the turn to Adam. Adam untaps, plays a Polluted Delta as his land, and then activates Liliana's +1 ability in order to shrink the opposition agent. He then for 1 mana casts an Allosaurus Shepherd, and then goes to pass the turn to Nate, and on Adam's end step, Nate casts an Agravian Find, targeting his Mystic Remora. It resolves, he puts the fish into his hand, and Nate then goes to his turn. On his turn, he untaps, plays on a Darkgar Wastes as his land, and then for 0 mana he casts a Lotus Petal. He then for 1 mana casts a Mystic Remora, and then for 1 black mana he casts Reanimate, targeting the Spellseeker in his graveyard. The Reanimate resolves, Spellseeker enters the battlefield, Nate loses 3 from Reanimate, and he's then reminded about the Aven Mind Sensor, so he looks at the top 4 cards of his library, and he fails to find any tutorable cards. With nothing left, Nate passes to Joseph. Joseph untaps, and at the beginning of his first main phase adds 1 green mana due to his Carpet of Flowers. He then plays a Rejuvenating Spring as his land for turn, and then taps his mana to cast his commander. He then goes to combat and swings his Collector Oof at Bill, and the rest of his creatures at Liliana. Both Liliana and Bill take enough damage to be taken out of the game. With nothing left, Joseph passes the turn to Adam. Adam untaps, plays a Cavern of Souls as his land for turn, and when it enters the battlefield, he names Elf. He then, with nothing left, goes to pass the turn to Nate, and on Adam's end step, Nate for a blue mana casts a Brainstorm. Nate then goes to his turn, untaps, and in his upkeep pays 1 mana to keep his Mystic Remora around. He then plays an Ancient Tomb as his land for turn, and then taps his mana, taking 2 damage from Ancient Tomb to cast a Rhystic Study. In response to this, Adam taps his mana to cast an Ad Nauseam. He does not pay for fish, and Ad Nauseam then resolves, and he starts flipping cards until he feels like he's at a low enough life total. He stops at 11 life. Nate then, with priority back on his turn, goes to combat, swings Spellseeker at Adam, Adam takes the 1 damage, and Nate then passes to Joseph. Joseph untaps, and at the beginning of his first main phase makes 1 green mana from Carpet of Flowers. He then plays a Bountiful Promenade as his land for turn, and then he then casts a Noble Hierarch, paying for Rhystic Study. He draws off of his commander's trigger and puts an island onto the battlefield. He then for 1 mana casts a Llanowar Elves, again paying for Rhystic, and again draws a card and puts a Dryad Arbor onto the battlefield from his commander's trigger. He then casts a Priest of Titania, again paying for Rhystic Study, again drawing and putting a forest onto the battlefield. He then goes to combat and swings Drannith, Destiny Spinner, and his commander at Adam for 5 total damage, and he swings Aven Mindcensor at Nate for 2. Both of his opponents take the damage, and Joseph then passes the turn to Adam. Adam untaps, plays a swamp as his land, and then casts a Wild Growth, paying for Rhystic Study, but not the Mystic Remora, so Nate draws. He then casts an Earthcraft, not paying for either this time, and he then uses Earthcraft, tapping his creatures to untap his lands to generate enough mana to cast Rankle, Master of Pranks. He does not pay for Rhystic, and he then goes to combat and swings Rankle at Nate for 3 damage. On attack, he triggers all 3, triggering the discard, the draw, and the creature sacrifice. In response to the trigger, Adam pays 2 life to cast Noxious Revival, targeting his Toxic Deluge. He does not pay for Rhystic, Toxic Deluge goes to the top of his library, and then all 3 of the Rankle modes resolve. With nothing left to do on his turn, however, Adam passes the turn to Nate. Nate untaps and in his upkeep pays 2 mana to keep his fish around with the Ancient Tomb, taking 2 damage. He then plays a Morphic Pool as his land for turn, and then goes to combat and swings Opposition Agent at Adam. Adam cannot block and takes enough damage to lose the game. In his second main phase, Nate casts a Supreme Verdict, successfully destroying all of the creatures left on the board. He then for 0 mana casts a Mana Crypt, and then for 2 mana casts a Thought Vessel. He follows this up by casting an Arcane Signet, and with nothing left, he passes the turn to his opponent, Joseph. On his turn, Joseph in his first main phase makes a white mana with his Carpet of Flowers, and then plays an Ancient Tomb as his land for turn. He then for 0 mana casts a Jeweled Lotus, not paying for Mystic or Rhystic. He then cracks it for 3 blue to help cast his commander, not paying for Rhystic Study. He then casts an Eternal Witness, this time paying for Rhystic Study, and in response to Joseph's commander's trigger, Nate for a white mana casts a Path to Exile, targeting Joseph's commander. It resolves, his commander is exiled, and he gets a tapped island to the battlefield. His commander's trigger then resolves, and he draws a card and puts a Flooded Strand onto the battlefield, and then the Eternal Witness resolves, and when it enters the battlefield, he returns his Collector Oof to his hand. Joseph then for 2 mana casts this Collector Oof, not paying for Rhystic Study, and with nothing left, he passes the turn to Nate. Nate untaps and in his upkeep takes no damage from his Mana Crypt. He pays for Fish, also in his upkeep, taking 2 damage from Ancient Tomb. In his first main phase, he plays a Plains as his land for turn, and he then casts a Stormscape Familiar. He then casts a Blind Obedience, and he goes to pass the turn to Joseph, and on Nate's end step, Joseph pays 1 life to crack his Flooded Strand to get a tapped Hollowed Fountain to the battlefield. Joseph then goes to his turn, and in his first main phase, makes 1 white mana from his Carpet of Flowers. He then recasts his commander again, paying for Rhystic Study, and when his commander enters the battlefield, it enters tapped due to Blind Obedience. He then goes to combat and swings a total of 4 damage at Nate. Nate declares no blockers, and with nothing left, Joseph passes the turn to Nate. Nate untaps and decides that his fish has run its course, and he lets the Mystic Remora go to his graveyard. He also takes no damage from his Mana Crypt, and as his land for turn, he plays a Cavern of Souls, naming Human when it enters. He then casts an uncounterable Zur the Enchanter, and with nothing left, he passes the turn to Joseph. Joseph untaps and in his first main phase makes a green mana from his Carpet of Flowers. He then plays a Flooded Grove as his land for turn, and he then takes 2 damage from his Ancient Tomb to activate his commander to bounce his Eternal Witness to his hand. He then recasts this Eternal Witness, paying for Rhystic Study, and off of his commander, drawing a card, but has no land to put out into the battlefield. Eternal Witness then re-enters the battlefield, and he returns Aven Mindcensor to his hands. He then for 3 mana casts Aven Mindcensor, paying for Rhystic Study, and in response to his commander's trigger from this creature cast, Nate casts a Vampiric Tutor for 1 black mana. Nate searches up a card to the top of his library, loses 2 life, and Joseph then draws off of his commander's trigger and puts a Cavern of Souls onto the battlefield, and when it enters, he names Drake. With nothing left, Joseph passes the turn to Nate. Nate untaps and takes no damage from Mana Crypt in his upkeep. He then plays an Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth as his land for turn, and goes to combat and swings Zur at Joseph. Unfortunately, due to the Aven Mindcensor, he is only able to look at the top 4 cards from this attack trigger, and he unfortunately hits nothing. He then in his second main phase casts a Phyrexian Arena, extorting it, so Joseph loses one and Nate gains one, and he then goes to pass the turn to Joseph, and on Nate's end step, Joseph convokes out a Chord of Calling, X equaling 1. He does not pay for the Rhystic Study, so Nate draws, and in response to this, Nate overloads a Cyclonic Rift. The Cyclonic Rift resolves, bouncing all of Joseph's permanents to his hand, and the Chord of Calling then resolves, and Joseph puts a Shrieking Drake onto the battlefield. When it enters, it bounces itself to Joseph's hand, and Joseph then goes to his turn. In his first main phase, he casts a Mana Crypt, not paying for the Rhystic Study, and it enters tapped due to Blind Obedience. He then casts his commander again, paying for Rhystic Study, which also enters tap from Blind Obedience. He then recasts his Collector Oof, not paying for Rhystic and drawing off of his commander, but has no land to put out. In response, Nate floats all of the mana he can from his mana rocks, and Joseph then immediately goes to combat, and this mana fizzles. In his second main phase, Joseph recasts his Aven Mind Sensor, drawing off his commander, not putting a land out, and with nothing left, he passes to Nate. Nate untaps and in his upkeep takes no damage from his Mana Crypt. He then loses 1 life to Phyrexian Arena, drawing a card, and in his first main phase, he plays an Exotic Orchard. He then goes to combat and again swings Zur at Joseph, looking at the top 4 off of the attack trigger, but again finding nothing. He then for 2 mana casts a Tainted Pact. The Tainted Pact resolves and he starts revealing cards until he finds one he likes. He goes pretty deep into his library and decides to stop when he hits Jace, Wielder of Mysteries. He then casts this Jace in a second main phase, and then for 2 mana casts a Limb Duel's Vault. He looks at the top 5 cards in his library and decides those are the ones he wants, so he rearranges them, puts them back, and he then activates Jace's +1 ability to mill Joseph for 2 and then draw a card. With nothing left, Nate passes the turn to Joseph. Joseph untaps, takes 3 damage from his Mana Crypt, and then in his first main phase, he casts an Eternal Witness, paying for Rhystic Study. Off of the commander trigger, he draws, but has no land to put out. Eternal Witness then enters the battlefield, returning Joseph's Cyclonic Rift to his hand. He then casts Cyclonic Rift, targeting Stormscape Familiar, not paying for Rhystic Study. The creature gets bounced, and then Joseph swings 5 total damage at Jace, doing enough to take Jace out of the game. In his second main phase, Joseph casts Shriekwing Drake, not paying for Rhystic. He draws a card and puts an Arid Mesa onto the battlefield off of his commander. When Shrieking Drake enters, he decides to have the Drake bounce itself to his hand. He then recasts Drake, not paying for Rhystic, drawing a card and putting a Windswept Heath onto the battlefield. Drake bounces itself, he recasts Drake, does not pay for Rhystic, draws a card, has no land to put out. He bounces the Drake to his hand, he again recasts Shrieking Drake, has no land to put onto the battlefield, and he then cracks his Windswept Heath to shock in a Breeding Pool. He then again casts his Shrieking Drake, not paying for Rhystic, draws a card, has no land to put out. Drake bounces itself, and again he recasts Drake, doesn't pay for Rhystic, draws a card, has no land. He then cracks his Arid Mesa to shock in a Temple Garden. He then taps his mana to cast a Ranger Captain of Eos, not paying for Rhystic Study. He draws a card, but has no land to put out. Off of the Ranger trigger, he finds a Boreal Druid, puts that to his hand, and then goes to pass the turn, and on his end step, Nate casts an Enlightened Tutor, just seeing if there's anything left. He unfortunately fails to find, and then it continues to Joseph's end step. Joseph discards the hand size, and Nate then goes to his turn. Nate untaps, and on his upkeep, Joseph sacrifices his Ranger Captain of Eos to prevent Nate from casting any non-creature spells this turn. Still in his upkeep, Nate loses 3 due to his Mana Crypt, and he then loses 1 life due to the Phyrexian Arena, drawing an extra card. He then recasts his Stormscape Familiar, casts a Ghostly Pilferer, and then swings Zur the Enchanter at Joseph, looking at the top 4, but finding nothing. And with a heavy heart and a light library, he passes the turn to Joseph. Joseph untaps, takes 3 damage from his Mana Crypt in his upkeep, and then uses his commander to bounce his Eternal Witness to his hand. He then replays Eternal Witness to get the Ranger Captain back to his hand, and he then recasts the Ranger Captain of Eos. At this point, Nate has no interaction and the game is essentially over, and let me explain why. At this point, Joseph makes it clear that he has 2 counterspells in his hand with a way to basically continually re-get Ranger Captain of Eos. Now, although you can't see Nate's hand, he does have a Thassa's Oracle in his hand with just enough devotion to win the game on his turn if the Thassa's resolved. Unfortunately, due to the Ranger Captain being there, Nate can't really stop Joseph's counterspells, and since he just doesn't have enough cards in his library or enough cards in his hand to really deal with that, it is kind of just over for Nate. Joseph can continually lock Nate out of casting Thassa's Oracle until Nate either draws out or Joseph finds a combo piece to combo with Shrieking Drake and go infinite on his own turn. With that all being said, Nate realizes that he really has no outs at this point, and rather than play it out for another 15 minutes or so, he decides to concede the game to Joseph. Now, we don't normally show games where 2 players exit the game fairly early or games that end in a concede, but we thought this one was actually pretty interesting because it had a lot of interaction, it had people really going for an early win, and it had some what we thought interesting decision making towards the end when it was just down to Joseph and Nate. Nate unfortunately didn't have the exact cards he needed from drawing from the Mystic and Rhystic in order to close the game out once Adam was out of the game, so he was kind of just holding on, hoping that I didn't find the pieces I needed. Fortunately for me, I did have the tutor to find Shrieking Drake. However, unfortunately at that point, I had no way to deal with the Rhystic study, so I had to hope that I drew something before Nate did. So it was an interesting back and forth with a lot of card draw, and really it was a lot of aggressive gameplay at that point, in my opinion. I'm just continually recasting Shrieking Drake into his Rhystic study purposely, hoping that I just win before he does. And I don't know if that situation is interesting for you guys to watch, but in my opinion, it was a really interesting game to play, even though this one did last quite a while. That being said, we hope you did enjoy this episode. If you did, let us know in the comments, like the video if you did like it, and subscribe if you're not already. We have another video coming up very soon with this same pawn, so if there's a commander you wanted to see perform, you might perform in that one later on in what we're calling Recycled Cardboard, so we hope you're excited for that, and be sure to subscribe so you know when that gets released. That all being said, that is all we have for this video. We hope you did enjoy it. We hope you have a fantastic rest of your day. I am Joseph, this is Casually Competitive MTG, and we will see you next time.